today we're going to be taking on the Ballad of Tam Lin. There's a lot to cover with this one, so to be honest, to keep it all straight, I'm mostly going to be reading out of my book, A New Dictionary of Fairies, because I think that that'll help me keep it in order and not go off on a lot of tangents. Because this is a very popular ballad, there's many versions of it, and there's a lot of material in it to go over. So, that all said, the Ballad of Tam Lin, it is one of the most significant Scottish ballads, particularly from a fairylore perspective. It can be found under various names and versions going back to 1549, so it's been around for a really long time. There are at least 50 different variations of this that I'm aware of. I'm sure there are more that I'm not aware of. It exists in ballad form, it exists in modern song form. Bands like Still I Span have covered it. It's probably my favorite version is by Tricky Pixie. There's multiple modern versions of it out there, many older variations of it. It's been turned into short stories, it's been turned into modern poems, it's been turned into modern novels. So, there's just so much to this particular ballad, and there's something in it that really seems to speak to people that has made it extremely popular across the years, and also sort of given it these multiple incarnations in all these different forms. For our purposes today, I am going to read one particular version of it in the more modern English, because as we've established, it was originally written in Scots. Some people do have some difficulty with Scots versus modern English. So I have modernized the language. The overall story arc is fairly consistent across the different versions. A young woman, variously named Janet or Margaret, occasionally other things besides that, but usually Janet or Margaret, is warned not to go to this particular well in the Carterhaugh Woods. She goes anyway. She has been told that anyone who goes there, particularly any woman who goes there, will have to pay a toll to the fairy knight that guards the well, and that toll is either going to be a gold ring, a green mantle or cloak, or her virginity. So Janet, or Margaret, chooses to go there anyway. Of course, encounters the guardian of the well, of course then ends up sleeping with him, and subsequently gets pregnant. Her family kind of becomes aware that she's pregnant. She returns then to the well. Again, there's multiple variations of exactly what happens at that point, but she ends up speaking to the elven knight again, sort of questions him, finds out that he was originally human, that he was taken into the fairyland by the fairy queen and turned into one of the fairies, and that he can be rescued if she is willing to try to rescue him, particularly on Halloween. And she has to be able to withstand him being changed into all these different forms. If she can do that and hold on to him, then he'll be freed from the fairies and he'll be able to go with her and marry her and happy ever after and all that. So that's sort of the general gist of the plot, which remains consistent across the different versions and even into most of the novelizations. So that all said, we are going to read through one version of the ballad, one of the older versions of the ballad, done though in the modern English. Oh, I forbid you, maidens all, that wear gold on your hair, to come or go by Carterhaugh, for young Tam Lin is there. There's none that go by Carterhaugh, but they leave him a treasure, either their rings or green mantles, or else their maidenhead. Janet has tucked up her green skirt a little above her knee, and she has braided her yellow hair a little above her eyebrows, and she's away to Carterhaugh as fast as she can go. When she came to Carterhaugh, Tam Lin was at the well, and there she found his steed standing, but away was himself. She had not pulled a double rose, a rose but only two, till up then started young Tam Lin, says, Lady, you'll pull no more. Why pull you the rose, Janet, and why break you the stem? Or why come you to Carterhaugh without my command? Cartaha it is my own, my daddy gave it to me. I'll come and go by Cartaha and ask no leave of you. Janet has tucked up her green skirt a little above her knee, and she has braided her yellow hair a little above her eyebrows, and she is to her father's house as fast as she can go. 24 ladies fair were playing at the ball, and out then came the fair Janet, the flower among them all. 24 ladies fair were playing at the chess, and out then came the fair Janet, as green as any glass. Out then spoke an old grey knight, laying over the castle wall, and says, Alas, fair Janet, for you but will be blamed all. Hold your tongue, you old-faced knight, some ill death may you die. Father my child on whom I will, I'll father none on you. Out then spoke her father dear, and he spoke meek and mild, and ever alas, sweet Janet, he says, I think you go with child. If that I go with child, father, myself must bear the blame. There's not a lord about your hall shall get the child's name. If my love were an earthly knight, as he's an elfin grey, I would not give my own true love for any lord that you have. The steed that my true love rides on is lighter than the wind. With silver he is shod before, with burning gold behind. Janet has tucked up her green skirt a little above her knee, and she has braided her yellow hair a little above her eyebrows, and she is away to Cartaha as fast as she can go. When she came to Cartaha, Tam Lin was at the well, and there she found his steed standing, but away was himself. She had not pulled a double rose, a rose but only two, till up then started young Tam Lin, says, Lady, you'll pull no more. Why pull you the rose, Janet, among the grove so green, and all to kill the bonny babe that we got us between? Oh, tell me, Tam Lin, she says, for his sake that died on tree, as in for Christ's sake, if ever you were in holy chapel or Christendom did see. Roxburgh he was my grandfather, took me with him to stay, and once it fell upon a day that woe did me betide. And once it fell upon a day, a cold day and windy, that we were from the hunting come, that from my horse I fell. The queen of fairies she caught me, in yonder green hill to dwell. And pleasant is the fairy land, but an eerie tale to tell. Yes, at the end of 7 years, we pay a time to hell. I am so fair and full of flesh, I'm afraid it will be myself. But the night is Halloween, lady, the morn is Hallowday. Then win me, if you will, for well I know you may. Just at the dark and midnight hour, the fairy folk will ride, and they that would their true love win, at Miles Cross they must bide. But how shall I know you, Tam Lin, or how my true love know, among so many uncouth knights, the like I never saw? Oh, first let pass the black, lady, and soon let pass the brown, will quickly run to the milk-white steed, pull you his rider down. For I'll ride on the milk-white steed, and yes, nearest the town, because I was an earthly knight, they give me that renown. My right hand shall be gloved, lady, my left hand will be bare. Tilted up shall my hat be, and combed down shall my hair. And that's the tokens I give you, no doubt I will be there. They'll turn me in your arms, lady, into a lizard and snake, but hold me fast and fear me not, I am your child's father. They'll turn me to a bear so grim, and then a lion bold, but hold me fast and fear me not, and you shall love your child. Again they'll turn me in your arms to a red-hot rod of iron, but hold me fast and fear me not, I'll do you no harm. And last they'll turn me in your arms into the burning coal, then throw me into well water, oh throw me in with speed. And then I'll be your own true love, I'll turn a naked knight, then cover me with your green mantle and hide me out of sight. Gloomy, gloomy was the night, and eerie was the way, as fair Janet in her green mantle to Miles Cross she did go. At the dark and midnight hour she heard the bridles sing. She was as glad at that as any earthly thing. First she let pass the black, and soon she let the brown, but quickly she ran to the milk-white steed, and pulled the rider down. So well she minded what he did say, and young Tam Lin did win. She covered him with her green mantle, as happy as a bird in spring. Out then spoke the Queen of Fairies, out of a bush of broom, "Them that has gotten young Tam Lin has gotten a stately groom." Out then spoke the Queen of Fairies, and an angry woman was she. Shame betide her ill-fared face, and an ill death may she die, for she's taken away the handsomest knight in all my company. But had I known, Tam Lin, said she, what now this night I see, I would have taken out your 2 gray eyes, and put in 2 eyes of a tree. So that's the full ballad version. Like I said at the beginning of all this, I highly encourage people to go and listen to it actually performed. Like I said, there's some great song versions out there. There's some more modern, even rock kind of song versions out there for people that like that sort of thing. And there's still the more traditional ballad versions that you can find for people that like that sort of thing. So there's a lot to go over. It's clearly a longer ballad. It has a lot of material in it. The first thing I want to kind of touch on is the name Tam Lin. There are variations. There are variations in all the names across the different versions. It's most commonly Tam Lin. Sometimes it's Tam Aline, sometimes Tam O the Lin, sometimes Tam Lane. It's not really a proper name as we would understand it. It's really more of a nickname or a name with an epithet. Tam is a version of the name Tom, so that's pretty straightforward. Lin or Lynn, though, in Scots, has a couple different meanings. The one that most likely applies here, though, is a waterfall or a pool of water. Lane, similarly, is a slow-moving stream. So Tam Lin, really, when we hear it, you have to kind of understand that it's really like Tom of the stream or Tom of the waterfall. Most likely because he guards a well. We can also sort of interpret it as like Tom of the Well. So the name itself has a lot of significance and meaning that I think a lot of people kind of miss out on, just not understanding the Scots and also not understanding that it's not really a proper name. There's a lot more going on with it than that. He is clearly a fairy who is guarding the well, hence why he has this name. There are a few alternate versions that kind of muddle this with Thomas the Rhymer, which we've already talked about, and will refer to the fairy knight as True Thomas. Clearly that sort of confusion or conflation comes in because they're both named Thomas, or Tom in this case. Tom obviously being a shortened version of Thomas. So at some point in some of the variations of this, the 2 stories, Thomas the Rhymer and Tam Lin, became sort of confused together because of the similarity in the names between the 2 protagonists, I guess we could say. So Tam Lin initially appears as a sort of mysterious figure who controls the woods, specifically around this well that he's guarding in Carterhaugh, which is an actual place. For the record, you can go and visit it. It is in Scotland. It really exists, just to be clear. I know sometimes people get a little confused when they're reading material like this. They sort of assume it's all like fantasy made up. But no, this is an actual location you can go to. It does really exist. It's interesting to note that there's this mention of green throughout the ballad. It's mentioned in particular that he'll take green mantles or green cloaks from maidens as one of the potential tolls, next to, of course, the gold ring or the virginity. It's also, of course, at the end, we see Janet is being told to throw her green mantle around him. It's interesting to note because green is particularly a fairy color, and there's actually a lot of superstition historically and even in some places, today, about not wearing the color green, particularly if you're a woman, because it's seen as being kind of unlucky for this reason. It's considered a fairy color. It attracts their attention. They don't always appreciate humans wearing it. So the mention of it here so early on in the story is kind of the first hint of fairy involvement. Janet, of course, has heard all these warnings and doesn't particularly care. There are some versions that explicitly mention her going by only the light of the moon. So it sort of implies she goes at night, kind of sneaks out. Obviously, no one is going to be particularly aware that she is doing this, and she's been explicitly told not to do this, not to go do the thing that she is going to do. She does know up front exactly what it is that this elfin knight who guards this well takes from the women who go there. So there is at least an implication that she is intentionally seeking this out. I will say that there is an ongoing debate about consent issues around the Ballad of Tam Lin. There are variations from version to version. In some of the versions, particularly older ones, it's very clear that Janet is a voluntary participant in the sex that happens in the ballad. However, in later versions of the ballad and later variations, that is not the case. There are some that are very unclear on how much consent is involved on Janet's part, and there are a few that seem to be strongly implying that she was not a willing participant in the initial encounter. So I'm mentioning this just because this is important to consider. You will run across people discussing whether Tam Lin is a rape story, what the consent issues are with the Ballad of Tam Lin. And the biggest thing to keep in mind really is that everything depends on which version of the ballad you are looking at, because they are vastly different in the consent or implied consent or lack thereof, depending on which one you're looking at. This includes as well some of the ones you'll hear performed are much more explicitly enthusiastic consent than some of the other ones that are out there that you'll hear performed, where it seems to imply that she was not willingly doing what the ballad implies she was doing. So, things to keep in mind. Janet arrives at the Cardara Wood at the well. Obviously, she finds initially the horse, but not Tam Lin. It does state that he was actually at the well, though. So the implication there is that he is physically present but invisible. And this is something, of course, that we see in widespread material relating to the good folk, to the fairies. This idea that they can pass invisibly directly next to human beings, that they can be standing right there and you just are not going to see them. So this is sort of what's being alluded to here, that there was some fairy glamour or enchantment involved, where he could see her but she could not see him. Because she sees the horse but not the guardian, and she clearly had gone there to find the guardian, I don't think there's any way to argue around that, she intentionally kind of reaches out and starts picking these roses. And she knows that this is a well that he guards. She kind of knows that this is, for lack of a better term, going to incite a reaction from him, which of course it does. He immediately appears and sort of intentionally confronts her about what she's doing and tells her that she, is not allowed to do that because the area belongs to him, and that, he takes the toll. She, of course, responds by saying that the woods do not belong to him, that Cardaha was given to her by her father, who is the lord of the area, and that she's going to do whatever she wants, which is a very challenging attitude to have towards one of the good neighbors, I think, particularly in 16th century Scotland. Either way, the interaction between the two is related in the ballad that I read. That version does not include any sex explicitly. Again, we find out later clearly that it did occur since she then is pregnant. But other versions, the sex is more obviously stated and, as I said, usually clearly consensual, but not always so. So we have one version, for example, that says, "He's taken her by the milk-white hand, among the leaves so green, and what they did I cannot say, the leaves they were between." So sort of a 16th century equivalent of fade to black scene. In another version, we see he took her by the milk-white hand and gently laid her down, just in below some shady trees where the green leaves hung down. So, in both of those, it's sort of implied that she was voluntarily doing this. Like I said, there's a lot that has to be read into what exactly is going on here. I do recommend for people who are really interested in digging more into this particular aspect of the ballad, there is a website called tamlin.org, TAM/LIN.org, in which you can find an article called Is Tam Lin a Rape Story, which really digs into all the nuances going on here, because it is a very complicated discussion, and I don't want to sidetrack this entire video by getting into that. What we do find, though, in version 39A, which is the one I read, is Tam Lin challenging Janet over her trespassing and pulling the roses, and then her response, and then basically it kind of goes to her rushing home. So the sex is entirely implied and not stated in any way. As far as we can tell, in all of the versions of the ballad, she has no more contact with Tam Lin after this. She goes home to her father's hall. At some point, it becomes kind of obvious to the people around her that she is, in fact, pregnant, that she is with child. And one of the king's knights, or the lord's knights, sorry, comments on it, kind of calls her out publicly for it. And sort of because he's concerned that she's going to get all of the men in the keep in trouble because they're all going to be accused of fathering this child. Even though she's sort of been publicly accused of this, what would have been a really significant transgression at the time, sex out of wedlock and pregnancy, her response is actually really bold. It sort of typifies the character of Janet or Margaret across these ballads. Not only did she have really the nerve to just go seek out this elven knight and get herself into this situation, but when she's publicly called out about the whole out of wedlock pregnancy thing, she yells right back. And it's sort of like, none of you will get the blame for this because, the father of this child is an elfin knight, effectively. It's also interesting to note that she does refer to him as her true love, which is something to contemplate considering she met him once and hasn't seen him since. Either way, though, once it's sort of been called out publicly, her father then also confronts her and is sort of like, I'm afraid this might be true. And Janet then, of course, has this long declaration about, her true love being an elfin knight, and that she refuses to give him up for any human lord. Basically, she's saying she will not just marry some human man that her father picks because she's pregnant to sort of legitimize things, that she loves this elfin knight and that she wants to stay with him. There's some interesting things we can note in this description. He's described as an elfin gray. Gray is a color that is often associated with the other crowd. That she talks about how his horse is shod with silver shoes in the front and gold in the back. It's impossible to know for sure kind of what that was supposed to mean. Obviously not with iron, because the good folk can't stand iron. But it's possible that the two different metals were, significant in some way and had some symbolic importance. Maybe, that the fact the horse moved between two different worlds. That's just a theory. Anyway, having gotten through all that, Janet immediately runs back to Cardahaw. This is now the second time that she's going to see Tam Lin. She pulls a couple roses. Interesting here that in the ballad it's sort of implied that she was doing that because she wanted to abort the child. It can also, of course, be read that she was actually doing it to just invoke Tam Lin's presence again, which is what happens. He appears. In other versions of the ballad, though, it is very explicit that she was advised to not keep the child. and that, she was told to pull these particularly abortifacient herbs, which, again, these are different versions of the ballad. And in those versions, there's kind of no mention of that. But Tam Lin kind of has some supernatural knowledge of her intentions. So she's advised in those versions to go find these abortifacient herbs. She shows up at the well, but before she can do anything, Tam Lin appears and is like, "What are you doing? Why are you trying to get rid of the baby that we made together?" And, it sort of implies that he sensed what she was doing even before she had taken any actual action. Of course, this is the point where she questions whether he is actually one of the gentry or if he ever was human. Seems a little late in the day for her to be concerned about this, but this is where it comes in the ballad. He then, of course, explains that he actually was born human and raised human. Depending on the version, depends on for how long. In some accounts, he was taken as a younger child by the queen. There are some versions, in fact, where he seems to have been quite young, and in other versions, it's implied that he was older, perhaps even like a teenager or a young man. Of course, there's that very sort of evocative description that he falls from his horse and the fairy queen catches him. This is something, again, that we see across multiple different ballads, this idea of the fairy sort of catching a person between life and death. The implication being the fall from the horse would have killed him, but the fairy queen intervened and took him in that transitional state, as it were. So, and again, there's different versions of this which connect him to different human characters, human lords. The one we mentioned in the verse I read was Lord Roxbury. He's also sometimes said to be the son of the Earl of Murray. So it's kind of implied that not only is he human, but he's also like a significant person. In some versions of the ballad, Janet knew him as a child, or Margaret, again, different names for that female protagonist, knew him as a child and recognized him when he identifies himself. In others, it's sort of implied that he might have been in the land of fairy for an amount of time. He kind of talks very explicitly about, in some versions, about being transformed into a fairy, what it's like to live in the land of fairies. And then, of course, he finally gets to this point where he mentions the tide to hell, the tide to hell, which I made an entire separate video about because that is a lot to get into. But he effectively is concerned that he is going to be given in this tide to hell, and he does not want that to happen. So he asks Janet to rescue him and says that, he can be with her, can be her husband, if only she will be brave enough to withstand these trials and save him, bring him back into the human world. Now, we can kind of argue some of the points here that are not explicitly stated. Was it necessary that Janet had to be pregnant in order to, have this rescue work? Because obviously he has been exacting this toll from many women who have been going through and passing by the well in Cardahaw, and this is the first one who is trying to rescue him. Is it because she's pregnant? Is she able to do it because she's pregnant and she has that connection to him through that? We don't know for sure. Also, of course, this is happening on the night before Halloween, which is a very significant liminal time in and of itself. The tide to hell by the fairies is paid on Halloween, so there's also this implication that it really has to happen at this time. In many versions of the ballad, the way it reads kind of implies that Janet was very early in the pregnancy, kind of had just become obvious to people. However, there are versions of the ballad where she is in fact heavily pregnant when she performs this rescue. There are some versions even where it's implied or stated that she gives birth shortly after he's rescued. So just something to keep in mind, that we do have these sort of variations going on. There are also variations in the exact instructions that she's given. In some versions, he tells her to take a handful of holy water and make a compass or circle around herself. And in this way, when she does this, the good folk cannot see her. So she kind of stands at this crossroads, makes this circle with holy water around herself. And as the fairies are passing by, she is invisible to them, which is an interesting turnaround from the usual fairies passing by humans who can't see them, which is in fact something we see at the beginning of the ballad with Tam Lin being at the well, but Janet cannot see him. Now we see her in this holy water circle, seeing the good folk passing by, but they're unable to see her. So just interesting little twist in the story. Again, though, that not all the versions have that, only some of them do. And again, other things that vary: the colors of the horses, the riding order of the horses. So he describes it initially, there will be a black horse, a brown horse, and then the white horse, which he's riding. In other versions, it's a group of attendants and a group of squires, and then the knights and the king and queen will come kind of last. So she has to wait for these groups to go by as opposed to individual horses. Either way, though, in any of the accounts, she eventually sees him and pulls him down. It is interesting to note, actually, that he's riding the white horse. There's a lot of symbolism to that in many accounts where we see the horse colors described. White is kind of reserved for the fairy queen or royalty or very significant people. A figure riding a white horse is kind of symbolically an important person. So he mentions that he's riding the white horse because he used to be an earthly knight. So they give him this sort of special accord because of that status. Just an interesting thing to note. There are, however, other versions where he is not riding a white horse. In other stories, he is riding a different colored horse. In at least one version, if I remember correctly, he's riding next to the queen, and the queen is on a white horse and he is on a blood red horse. Which again, that has a lot of significance in fairy lore. Red is a color strongly connected to the other crowd, particularly the more malicious or dangerous ones. So just interesting things to contemplate. And of course it mentions that initially the first thing she hears is the sound of the bridle bells on the horses. So this is sort of a big deal, this riding out of the good folk on the night before Halloween, on the night before Samhain. Everyone, it's like a big parade, if you kind of think of it that way. So of course she pulls him from the horse, and then he is turned into all of these sort of terrifying creatures. A snake, a bear, in some accounts a lion, just the sorts of things that most people would let go of. Of course eventually it's fire. There is a reference, of course, to him being turned into burning iron, hot iron. And that confuses some people because fairies can't do iron, but he's not literally a burning rod of iron. Just so we're all clear on that. This is fairy magic. This is glamour. This is her senses being fooled. He's not literally a snake. He's not literally a bear. He's not literally a burning rod of iron. These are all things that are supposed to frighten her and make her let him go. If at any point she lets him go, and we will discuss another ballad where this whole situation does not end as well for the main characters. If at any point she does let him go, then he will return to the group of fairies and she will lose her chance to rescue him and potentially have some other negative consequences. So the whole point is that they're trying to frighten her. He's not actually a piece of iron. Fairies can't do that. And then of course he turns into a burning coal, and that's her sign to throw him into water. And at which point he is freed from the fairies' enchantment. He no longer belongs to them. And in this sort of very rebirth-like scene, emerges naked, and she has to cover him with her green mantle, which is, again, a lot of symbolism going on there. It's obviously her claiming him for her own. There's also, some symbolism with the mantle. The plaid in particular in Scotland, plaid not being the pattern of colors, but a plaid being a type of mantle or cloak or thing you would wear, was used not only for clothing, but it was also used as a blanket. And there's sort of implications with it, or it's used poetically to refer to like what you would cover your family with or cover your loved ones with. So that's kind of all layered in here. But the most important thing is that she's really claiming him for herself. The Fairy Queen, of course, does not take this well. Many people try to read sort of a romantic angle into this, and in fact, a lot of the novelizations and sort of modern poetic interpretations implied that the Fairy Queen was in love with him, or that he was the lover of the Fairy Queen, and that she feels betrayed with all this. But there's a lot of implications in the ballad itself, when you read through all the versions, that he was something more like an adopted child, or sort of a son to the Fairy Queen. Particularly worth remembering that in several versions he's like 3 or 4 years old when she takes him. So I just recommend being a little cautious and not overly romanticizing or reading too much into that aspect of it. What she actually says, the Fairy Queen that is, what she actually says after Tam Lin has been won away, is that the person who has won him has gotten a good bridegroom, which, I think is where a lot of people read the romantic aspect in, but that can also be taken as a mother talking about a child. And then she basically curses Janet, sometimes more explicitly than others, but, curses her for having done this. And then says that had she known that this was going to happen, had she been aware basically that Tam Lin had fallen in love or had come to love this mortal woman, in the version I read, she talks about she would have taken out his eyes and put in eyes of a tree. In many other versions, she says she would have taken out his heart and put in a heart of stone. So again, that doesn't really read to me like a lover talking about another lover, because obviously if she took out his eyes or his heart, that would have affected her as well if she was like a rival for his affections. However, I could see that coming from a more parental figure, that she would rather he not be able to love and stay with the good folk than be won away to the mortal world by this woman, who she then, as I said, curses them. So I will say, to be fair, there is a version where the queen does say something to the effect of, whoever has won Tam Lin has gotten her heart's delight. I also think that might be where people are reading the romantic angle into this as well, which is fair. I mean, there are so many variations and versions of the ballad. It is possible that some of them did intend to imply this sort of love rivalry between the Queen of Fairies and Janet over Tam Lin. I think many of the other versions, though, just don't read that way. So, open to interpretation, we'll just say. Different versions. When we look sort of at everything that's going on here, and like I said, there's a lot going on here. We can see a lot of fairy lore in the overall ballad. We see the color green, as I mentioned. We see the tide to hell being referenced. We see the idea of the good folk stealing people, both children and adults, again, because of this range with the story with the age of Tam Lin. This idea that they're taken sort of in that moment between life and death. The idea that they pass invisibly. There's so many layers and layers to the material that shows up in this particular ballad. As I said, it is an immensely popular ballad. It's still performed today. It's still written about today. There's actually a really, really fun super modern version of it, which really adapts all the material. I'll try to link it in the comments. So it's something that there's something about the Ballad of Tam Lin that really speaks to people. It speaks to people across the centuries. It speaks to people across different life experiences, across different cultures. This idea, I suppose it comes down to, of a human being able to win their lover back from the good folk. This idea of a human who's been taken by the fairies being able to be brought back and return to the human world. The implication at the end of the ballad, of course, is that despite the fact that Janet has been cursed by the Fairy Queen, and you know quite what's going to go on with that, that Tam Lin is now human again and is able to marry her, and that they can be together to raise this child. I will say there's a very good novel called The Knowing by Kevin Manwaring, which kind of blends the story of Tam Lin with some of the folklore around Reverend Robert Kirk into this sort of modern fairy story. I super enjoyed it. You might like it as well if you like these videos and you're interested in this subject. I thought it was a very interesting twist on it. And I mention it because he did kind of take on the idea that Janet had been cursed. This is an aspect of the ballad I find that a lot of people sort of gloss over or ignore, that at the end the Fairy Queen curses Janet, or Margaret, again, for having succeeded, having won away Tam Lin. And we really don't know from the ballad what happened after that, what happened to Janet, how that curse played out. So The Knowing is sort of one book that looks at potentially how that went. I thought it was interesting. I enjoyed it. You might or might not. But to just sort of show you one of the ways that someone has taken that concept in a modern direction. As I said, because of its popularity, there are so many versions of this out there, so many songs, so many poems, novels, short stories. It's everywhere. But now you sort of know where that all comes from, the original ballad material, and kind of the root of all of this. As I did mention, though, this is so much to cover. I've really kind of given you, even though this is a 40-something minute video, really kind of given you the Cliff Notes version of this entire story. Every version has different layers to it and some different symbolism and some different things going on. I hope, though, that this is a good basic introduction to Tam Lin, and you at least kind of understand the key points that are happening in the story, in the ballad. And if it interests you, definitely check out tamlin.org. There's a ton of material on there to go through. My cat is over here saying hello at the end of the video. And we will leave it here for today. Next time, we will pick up again with the Fairy Ballad series. We'll probably look at the Ballad of the Elfin Knight, which is my personal favorite of all the ballads. So something to look forward to. But I hope you enjoyed this discussion of Tam Lin, and I will see everyone next time.